In this video, we're going to be discussing how to negotiate your first contract out of residency and how to get the best offer possible. So there's kind of 4 key steps that you want to do. Number 1 is to get a reference point for salaries so you know what to expect in terms of salary that you can ask for. Number 2, we're going to discuss whether or not you should get a contract lawyer. Number 3, we're going to talk about common contract terminology and lingo that you should know. And then number 4 is a common question that I get, which is, when should you start working after residency? So number 1 is to get a reference point for your salaries. And the reason this is so important is because it gives you information which you can use to negotiate. So the best thing that you can do is have offers in hand, which is by interviewing at multiple different places and then getting actual offers. Then you can use those as a bargaining chip while you're negotiating with other places. In lieu of having offers in hand, there's multiple sources that can give you a rough ballpark estimate for academic or non-academic practices. So for the academic side, we have the AAMC Faculty Salary Report. This lists total compensation based on academic rank, and it costs $60 for residents and fellows, or a whopping $1,500 for non-members. But apparently a lot of people have been able to get this for free by asking their program director or their department chair, as most academic institutions will have a copy of this. The other thing is this big data group called the MGMA, which collects physician salary data across the country. And you'll see this brought up a lot in salary negotiations, as there's a lot of places that do rely on this data in terms of figuring out what salary to offer physicians. Next is looking at state public records. If you live in certain states, then anybody who works in a public institution will have their salary publicly available, which you can view. For example, transparentcalifornia.com for all public employees in California. And then for the non-academic side, you have the MGMA, AMG, and SEA. These are all kind of big groups that collect salary data. So some notes for the MGMA data. This is sorted by region, and they report things in different percentiles. And so if you do see something listed as the 50th percentile for salary, you should note that that is for 2+ years of experience after graduation, not for a new grad. So if a job advertises 90th percentile MGMA, it could mean 90th percentile MGMA if you have experience, or 90th percentile for a new grad, which could explain why there could be a discrepancy at times. Apparently, academic institutions are required to carry a copy of the MGMA data, so this is a good place for you to look if you want to try and find that. And if you do end up getting a contract lawyer, most of them will have access to this data as well. Or if you want to pay for it out of pocket, it's $399 for 1 year or $699 for 2 years. So taking a look at what the MGMA data looks like, I was able to find a copy from 2021, and you can see it lists out the mean salary and then all the different percentiles for what people are making across the country. And here I pulled up some more internal medicine specialties for you to look at as well. Now, it also sorts things by geography. So if you're applying to the Eastern United States, the Midwest, South, or the Western United States, you can get a more granular look at what the salaries look like in those regions. Another useful resource is this website called OfferDX, which kind of compiles all of the different sites that are available for salaries and can give you a good ballpark on what to expect. And I also found a copy of the 2023-2024 AMGA report, which I'll include a link in the description below. So the bottom line is that it is helpful to look in multiple places to get a ballpark of what to expect for your salary and know what you can reasonably ask for. So some various resources include Reddit, Google, Medscape, OfferDX, etc. However, the gold standard for negotiating is offers in hand and MGMA data. So my thoughts are, number 1, apply to multiple places and get physical offers from them. And then that's going to be your key negotiating tool. If you are applying to another academic institution, consider getting the AAMC Faculty Salary Report, and then use whatever old MGMA data that you can find, and then find a contract lawyer who should have access to the updated data. So that leads us into the next question, which is, should you get a contract lawyer? So what are some reasons to get a contract lawyer? Number 1 is for protection against specific contract agreements that could potentially screw you over without you knowing about it. Number 2 is they can help you negotiate for a higher salary. And number 3, which I think is the most important, is providing that peace of mind that you're signing something and it's a solid contract. So do you really need a contract lawyer? This is from this guy on Reddit who I actually took a lot of this information from. He had a really good post on contract negotiations, but he says, look, it's up to you. It's your money. The answer is yes 99% of the time. Even if you're staying on wherever you did residency/fellowship, the answer is probably still yes. Your employers are not your friends, they are your bosses. They do not win by giving you extra money or extra perks. No matter how nice they seem or how much they seem to care, their priority is not your well-being, it is theirs. Your well-being may strongly factor into their offer to you, but it is not and will never be their first priority. So definitely something to keep in mind. So personally, I did end up getting a contract lawyer. And the things that they did for me was, number one, they obviously thoroughly reviewed my contract. And then they met with me on Zoom to go over specific areas of concern. For example, ensuring that tail coverage which was present, which is something we'll go over later. Clarifying what 18 days of admin duties entails, because this was listed in the contract and it was kind of vague and not clear. He helped me evaluate what the max number of nights I would be doing a year could be, and fixing an incorrect bonus date that was listed on the contract. And then he also was able to discuss how my offer compared to other offers he has seen. Specifically, one of the things he did mention is that even though I was staying at an academic institution where the pay is lower, there are some advantages of staying there, because if you decide to leave after a year or two, it's not really going to raise any red flags. Whereas if you went to an outside hospital and you left after 1 or 2 years, sometimes it may raise an eyebrow about why you left so quickly. But if you're staying on at the place you did residency at, it's not as big of a concern. And then finally, he helped me draft an email proposal to request changes. So here's the email he helped me draft. And you can see he's Victor Cotton. He's actually an MD and JD. And I believe he was an internist as well. So you'll find contract lawyers that really are very specialized in physician contracts. And so that's what I would highly recommend. But here in question number 1, we discussed tail coverage and how it was not mentioned in the documents. And we were asking to confirm that UC Davis provides tail coverage. There was an attachment that mentioned 18 days of administrative duties. So he wanted to clarify, does that mean 18 full days of work, or does it mean I would come in for a meeting or two on those 18 days? And then he requested to add a sentence in attachment A stating that I will work up to 14 nights a year. My understanding is that hospitalists are currently working 10 to 14 nights, and I am agreeable to doing so as well. However, I do not want to work more than 14 nights. And several other questions here, for example, reimbursing the cost of internal medicine board exam, fixing the bonus date, trying to negotiate for some time for external projects, and then also asking for a sign-on bonus or a relocation bonus. So one of the things that's just really nice about having a contract lawyer working with you is it just feels nice to have somebody on your team and kind of vouching for you. So the typical cost for a lawyer is about $500 to $1,500 as a one-time fee. In my case, my lawyer, who cost $900, attempted to negotiate for an additional $20,000 sign-on bonus, about $5,000 to $10,000 end-of-year bonus, and $16,000 worth of shift buy-down. So you can see how just a very small cost could really pay off dividends if you do go the route of getting a contract lawyer. And here's a quote from the surgeon who posted that initial Reddit thread. For most people, the return on investment of a contract lawyer is in orders of magnitude. Using myself as an example, I got offered my dream job at a salary that I felt was extremely competitive, and I would have taken it with zero negotiation. My contract lawyer, who cost me a flat $750, told me to ask for $50,000, $100,000, and $150,000 more on years 1, 2, and 3 of my salary job. And he's like a hepatobiliary surgeon, so that's why he's able to ask for so much additional. He said to ask in very plain language, do not embellish why you want or need more money or why you deserve it. Just plainly state you would like the salary to be XYZ and see what happens. My job came back and offered me 10% more across all 3 years, at which point my contract lawyer told me, I've worked with your institution before and they can always be negotiated up at least 10%. I thought we would actually get more, but this is still really good, and in 3 years we can do better. Holy crap, was he right? Because I would have taken their first offer, and 10% was a lot of money compared to the $750 he cost me, because this is now the floor for my salary at this place for the rest of my life. Over a 10 or 20 year career, this will be like an extra $1 million or something silly. So what if you're applying to a place that does not do negotiations? And this actually applied to me because I, negotiated for this additional salary sign-on stuff. And I actually was applying to an academic institution where they do not do negotiations. And you'll find that a lot of large institutions like Kaiser, academic systems, or large hospital systems may not do negotiations. So at first I was bummed out and felt like I had wasted $900, which is a lot of money while you are a resident. But in retrospect, I'm still extremely glad that I did it. The reason is because the potential upside is very high, whereas the long-term cost over the course of your entire career is essentially negligible. Even if they aren't able to negotiate a higher salary for you, they can still help you to ensure that there's no red flags or unfavorable terms in the contract, and they may be able to negotiate other things whose value would be greater than the money you spent on the lawyer. And finally, again, the biggest aspect is probably the peace of mind that you'll get with having a contract lawyer. So this person wrote, "I do not think a contract lawyer is worth it 99% of the time. A friend of mine just signed a great contract, but when she asked if this was negotiable, they said no. We all signed it like this, and you are no exception. She got a contract lawyer anyway, and they weren't kidding. It was take it as is or leave it." This person responded, "I mean, at that point, you're out what? Like $1,000? It's worth it for the peace of mind. I've heard horror stories of people who sign on to private practice groups where they thought they would have a great RVU-based compensation package, but the contract allowed partners to punt all of their low-paying patients out onto them, and it was a total nightmare. Plus, there's a pretty solid chance that there is some wiggle room that pays for itself. $1,000 is like 0.3% of a normal physician salary. So when should you get a contract lawyer? So the best time to get a contract lawyer is once you have a term sheet or a letter of intent. And this is where it's very important to clarify that there's a difference between getting that initial letter of intent and having the formalized contract. And so before you ask for the contract, this is when you want to get the contract lawyer and start doing the negotiations. It's much easier to ask for things, set expectations, and negotiate before you get to the actual contract. And so it's best practice to not sign or accept a letter of intent before doing negotiations. The reason is because a letter of intent, while it's not legally binding, is equivalent to a handshake. That's basically saying you're accepting of their terms. So if you accept the letter of intent at $300,000, but then you come back to the employer and later request $330,000 during the contract stage, it just doesn't come across very well and it doesn't look that great. Now let's move on to the many different terms that you should negotiate besides salary. And starting off with vacation, the first example I want to bring up is, what if it says 4 weeks off? Is there anything specific that you should do in this situation? Well, the key thing here, and with the entire contract in general, is to be as specific as possible. So you need to clarify, does 4 weeks off mean 20 days or does it mean 28 days, including the weekends? And consider asking for a very specific breakdown. For example, 20 personal days, 5 holidays, and 3 CME days. And doing something like this really helps protect you from having the vague 4 weeks be changed later down the line. And if you find out during this process that 4 weeks only means 20 days, potentially you could use this as leverage to negotiate for other things. So basically you're saying, well, this is only 20 days when I thought it was going to be 28 days. So in exchange, can you negotiate this other aspect of the contract for me instead? In terms of the signing bonus, student loan reimbursement, CME money, yearly bonus, and retirement matching, in general, it never hurts to ask for more. And a good rule of thumb for a good target is about 10% more is what you should be aiming for. Regarding additional and voluntary call and night shifts, you want to negotiate the pay for voluntary call. So make sure it's listed in the contract that the rate for voluntary call is going to be X, Y, or Z. And then see if you can set a clear maximum for additional call or night shifts if it's not clearly defined in the contract already. The next thing I want to talk about is FTEs, or full-time equivalents. And this is something that's often offered at academic institutions, and it's a way that you can buy down your clinical time. It's one of the reasons that working at an academic center could be better than a community practice for some people, because you may be doing less clinical work while still making 100% FTE. So for example, I am 100% FTE, but the breakdown is 83% clinical, 12% for this hospital medicine track that I'm co-running with another person, and 5% for EMR projects. So it's really nice to have that variation in your schedule, but still be making 100% of your salary. So this is worth negotiating for if you're looking for clinical buy down time, if there are other projects that you already know that you're interested in. Now let's talk about termination and restrictive covenants, or non-competes. And this is probably the most important part of the contract, because this is the part of the contract that often can screw people over. So most people think that they will work for a place for a very long time. You don't go into these contracts thinking that you're going to be leaving this place very soon. But the reality is 50% of people will leave after 1 or 2 years. So it's very important to see the terms for how they can terminate you and also your ability to terminate the contract if you need. One key thing to look at is, do you lose anything or have to give anything back in order to terminate the contract? A lot of these contracts, for example, if they give you signing bonuses or retirement matching or student loans, if you leave within a certain time frame, you're going to have to pay all of that back, sometimes with interest. And so that's one way that it can make it very difficult for you to get out of contract. Look out for things like an accelerated termination date, which allows employers to move up your termination date. So instead of a 90-day notice that you thought you would be getting, suddenly you realize you're going to be getting your last paycheck now, and you're just going to have nothing for the next while you're looking for a new job. Look out for extended separation periods, which means that you'll have to continue working for them for several months, even after you terminate the contract, which again could kind of lock you into working for them up to a year sometimes I've seen. One key clause that you should have in your contract is a line saying that you can terminate the contract without cause. This is a very beneficial term for you to have in your contract. And non-competes are enforceable in some states, not in California, however. But it's very important to look up the specific enforceability depending on what state you're in and negotiating this down if it may impact your ability to find a job if you leave that position. And even in places where it is not enforceable, sometimes it takes a lot of legal trouble and it's just very time consuming and tedious to try and fight against non-competes. So in general, it's very much in your best interest to negotiate this down as much as possible in the contract stage so that you don't have to deal with all that headache in the future. Moving on to practice sites, outside services, and intellectual property. Make sure you know what sites or hospitals you will be expected to work at and make sure it says it very clearly. So all of a sudden, halfway through your job, they don't suddenly spring on you that you have to work at a hospital that's like 50, 60 miles away or something. Evaluate their stipulations for doing outside work or moonlighting. And if you are an inventor, it's important to assess their intellectual property clause to see how much of your intellectual property they are going to claim when you use their resources to develop a new invention. In terms of malpractice insurance, this is another very important one. And in general, everybody needs to make sure they have tail coverage. So let's go over the common malpractice insurance clauses that you may see. So the most basic one is called claims made, and this will only cover claims or lawsuits that are made and filed during your policy period. So for example, let's say you work for a place for 5 years, and unfortunately you get sued during that 5-year period, you would be covered. But let's say you left the job and 10 years later, somebody decided to sue you for something that happened while you were working at that hospital, you would no longer be covered. So the addition of tail coverage is something that would cover you in that scenario. So even after you leave the job, for example, 10 years later, if somebody sues you for something that happened while you were working there, you would still have coverage. And finally, you have occurrence coverage, which is kind of the most comprehensive coverage and basically covers you for any lawsuits down the line for, pretty much lifelong. And a lot of times this isn't offered. So at the very least, you want to make sure that you have tail coverage. So there are a lot of physician retention traps that you should look out for. So one of them is tail insurance that is only paid for over time. For example, for each year of service, the job will only pay 20% of the tail coverage cost. Thus, it will require working at least 5 years before they would cover 100% of the tail coverage. If you left earlier than 5 years, then you would be on the hook for this fee. So obviously, this would strongly discourage you from ever leaving this place early. Next is extreme or highly restrictive non-compete clauses. For example, a restrictive covenant of a 50-mile radius, which would basically force you to move away if you left that job. And then a very, very common one that you'll see is long periods to vest in your retirement. For example, Kaiser has this really, really great pension, and it's often called the golden handcuffs. And the reason it's called that is because it takes 5 years until you are vested. And also, the pension continues to get better and better the longer you stay with Kaiser. And so again, it really discourages you from leaving, especially in that initial 5-year period. But even afterwards, you're discouraged discouraged from leaving because your pension is not going to be as good if you leave early. For the UC system, we also have a pension plan that has a 5-year vesting period, but there is an alternative of a savings choice plan that has immediate vesting instead. So if there is any uncertainty of whether you're going to stay at a place for 5 years or longer, then you should really look into the retirement vesting and see if that may affect you. Next, we already kind of talked about this, but having to pay back sign-on bonuses or housing stipends if you leave within a certain time frame. For example, this is very common. You may get a generous $100,000 down payment for a house as a signing bonus, but if you leave in the first 3 to 5 years, then you have to pay it all back, potentially with interest. And in general, for your contract negotiations, be wary of any language that says at the employer's discretion or scheduled to be determined by the hospital. Remember, we want to be as clear as possible and avoid vagueness whenever we can. Get things in writing, clearly written down, so you know what your expected schedule and duties are, so that your employer cannot suddenly change things months down the line. And finally, don't be nervous about negotiating. You are actually in a very good bargaining position. And, this feels like a very uncomfortable thing for people because we've never had to do something like this before, but employers expect you to negotiate and they won't reject you for negotiating. If they do reject you for negotiating, that's probably a red flag anyways, and probably not a place you would want to work at. So ask for more than what you want. So request 6 or 7 different things and then settle for getting 3 or 4 of them. Aiming for 10% more than what they offer is often a good target. And if you feel uncomfortable, ask your contract lawyer to help you do the negotiation process. And finally, your most important bargaining chip is to be okay with walking away. That's ultimately the strongest tool that you have in doing these contract negotiations. So you have to be okay with doing that if they're not giving you terms that are acceptable to you. So remember, get a good reference point for salaries, get a good contract lawyer. Now you could consider skipping it if you're going to a well-established, large institution, since the chances of them trying to screw you with a bad contract are pretty low. And also they usually don't do negotiations. But personally, I still recommend you do it because the payoffs could be exponential. You never know if there could be a little bit of wiggle room with the negotiations. You can catch any concerning languages or terms, and the peace of mind is totally worth it. And ultimately, $1,000 is a very low price to pay for this service. Remember to negotiate everything and watch out for those common physician retention traps. Now, one last common question that I get is, when should I start working after residency? And it obviously depends on your personal circumstances. However, I personally feel like there may be an advantage to keeping it to a 2-month break between residency and starting work. For example, finishing residency on June 30th and then starting on August 29th. First of all, this is because it'll give you adequate time to study for the boards and then also have some leftover time to vacation or relax. But one additional advantage of only taking a 2-month gap is that you won't need to pay for health insurance during this gap. The reason is because you can have COBRA, or continuation of health coverage insurance, that can cover you during a 2-month gap, and you don't actually have to pay for it. You can actually retroactively activate it within 60 days of leaving a job. So for example, you can choose not to pay for any insurance for a 2-month period, and then say you get sick on day 59 and you need to be hospitalized, you can actually retroactively activate your COBRA at that time and pay for it. Otherwise, if nothing happens to you for that 2 months, you basically didn't have to pay for any insurance for 2 months. If you waited 3 months instead to start, then you would actually have to look into insurance options and pay for the full 3 months. Another thing you can do is consider negotiating with your employer about starting your health insurance coverage earlier, so you have some coverage in between residency and starting your official attending job. Here's a lot of helpful posts and articles that I looked up for this presentation. I hope this video was useful for you guys. I definitely recommend you do some more of your own reading on this topic and look through some of these resources here. And I hope you guys found this video helpful. I'll see you in the next video, and peace.